Japan has a serious teenage delinquency problem. This may come as a surprise to many, as most videos about Japan on YouTube are positive. How Japan is the future, how their streets are so clean, and of course, how the Japanese people are so polite, respectful, and well-mannered. So in this video of a Japanese teenager went viral internationally, which was of him going to a conveyor belt sushi chain, then licking their soy sauce bottle in which everybody uses, licking the cups, then putting his saliva on the rotating sushis which were to be eventually eaten by other customers. Many individuals would have tilted their heads and were left much confused. This is as such was definitely not the type of behavior that we expect from the Japanese people, including their soon-to-be adolescents who received the education and guidance from these responsible, well-mannered adults of Japan. And although this video of the blown high schooler was indeed the video that went viral, there were previously many other similar instances of these quote-unquote conveyor belt sushi villains posting their behavior on social media. And the behavior does not only apply to teenagers, as many adults were also recorded in doing similar acts, including old Japanese grandmothers. And if these are the cases that are caught on camera in the analog nation of Japan, where most people, including many teenagers, are still not used to using technological devices such as smartphones, you can only imagine that for one video showing delinquent behavior posted on social media, there are probably tens or even hundreds more of such cases of delinquency happening in real life all across Japan. So what is happening in Japan? Why are so many people in Japan, usually and in often cases rightfully considered as the most polite and respectful group of people in the world, all of a sudden putting saliva on conveyor belt sushis and laughing hysterically with absolutely no sense of guilt? And why are the teenagers and young adults of Japan especially so susceptible of conducting such delinquent behavior? In today's video, we'll be finding out the answer to this question, as well as discuss the potential solutions that could be implemented in order to reduce, or hopefully bring an end to such overt delinquency in Japan. So let's get into it. Let us first talk about the case of the blown high schooler whose video went viral, thus bringing all of the conveyor belt sushi quote-unquote pranks that were happening in Japan to the public light. This high schooler was a junior at Ginan Technical High School, soon to graduate from high school in a year's time. He conducted his delinquent acts of licking and putting saliva on sushis and other items at a famous sushi chain in Japan called Sushiro, which is currently the largest conveyor belt sushi chain in Japan in terms of domestic sales numbers. And when the boy's TikTok video went viral and received national spotlight, the mother of the high schooler took his son and apologized at the restaurant together. By the way, although not entirely sure about the mother's true sentiments, the apology from the high schooler at least did not seem genuine. This is as when a Japanese influencer contacted this high schooler after the video went viral, the high schooler supposedly said that he personally had no idea why everyone was making such a big deal out of nothing. So quite justifiably so, despite the formal apology conducted by the high schooler and his mother, the sushi restaurant chain did not accept the apology and said that they'll still file suit both from the criminal and civil perspectives. Before we get into the answer to this question, we have to first acknowledge the fact that it is quite inaccurate to use the word emergence when describing the problem of teenage delinquency in Japan, as this has already been a prominent problem in Japan for several decades. There has been research papers analyzing the cause to the increase in delinquent behavior by Japanese adolescents from as early as 1982. It's just that until now, most of the issues stayed within domestic realms without ever being covered by the Western media such as the BBC. And we also cannot forget the fact that in the especially analog nation of Japan, where people still use fax machines and floppy disks in their business practices, as well as a significant portion of the population still carrying flip phones, it still has only been a couple of years, or even months at best, when it comes to delinquent teenagers carrying smartphones and actually using the cameras attached to their smartphones to film their delinquent behavior and upload it on social media platforms such as TikTok. This means that the vast majority of delinquent acts in the past in Japan were never filmed or recorded for the majority population to actually visually see and be just able to tangibly realize how bad some of these acts really were. Before we get any deeper, we have to also first be acutely aware of the fact that teenage rebellion is a problem that exists globally, and the roots of the problem may indeed share some common ground interculturally. However, at least in the case of delinquent behavior among the Japanese teenagers, it seems that the sense of alienation may act as a strong contributor in pushing them to conduct overtly delinquent acts. According to Professor Sakuta of Keio University, around 80% of Japanese teenagers feel a sense of alienation, meaning that the teenagers feel that they can trust nobody but themselves. And while the sense of alienation does not always necessarily lead to delinquent acts, it does make the young teenage mind more liable to commit delinquency. So in this sense, the blonde high schooler who committed his delinquent acts at the Conveyor Belt sushi chain may have very well been also a victim of this deep sense of alienation from his peers, and conducted his acts and posted it on TikTok in order to gain attention and respect from his peers and feel included rather than alienated. We all know of that one quote-unquote loco kid back in school who'd conduct all kinds of crazy acts just because they enjoyed the sense of approval and the subsequent sense of inclusion that they felt from usually the rest of the other delinquents. And in his paper, Professor Sakuta makes the following suggestions for treating the teenage delinquency in Japan. And I believe the measures in which he proposes can be applicable not only to teenage delinquents in Japan, but also to the delinquents in other nations as well. First, Professor Sakuta suggests that positive relations between the parent and the child from a young age is essential. So on this note, parents of the children do possess a large responsibility in having to provide a warm and healthy domestic environment for the children to grow into adolescence in order to prevent them from potentially turning into teenage delinquents. Secondly, working hard to allow these teenagers to increase their level of self-confidence is tremendously important. This, I believe, is particularly important in the case of Japan. This is as in Japan's perfectionist culture, perfect execution of any given task is often a very natural given rather than something that should be praised for. Thus, the act of praising is still rarely a thing in Japan, even when you grow into an adult and move into the workplace. So in Japan, when a teenager works tremendously hard to achieve a positive result in an area such as in an academic examination, rather than praising the teenager, a lot of parents just take the stance as in, quote-unquote, "You should have gotten 100 in the test anyways. It's just a natural result and nothing to be praised for." And I believe this may not only be a Japanese tendency, but an Asian tendency in general in many households. Just to provide a personal experience in this, my father used to epitomize this type of behavior. My father, being the financially irresponsible person that he was, always putting and wasting all of our family savings in secret in the stock market without telling my mother, and just so much more, never ever supported me in my academic endeavor during my teenage years. So needless to say, when all of my friends were receiving after-school tutoring and going to after-school academies or cram schools, as it is the case for almost all kids in Asia nowadays, such as in the case of South Korea and Japan, where entering a prestigious university is seen as a do-or-die task, I never once was able to attend an after-school cram school or receive tutoring of any sort during my years in middle and high school. But then I still did manage to do quite decently through self-study and performed quite well academically through just sheer toil thanks to the type of endless energy that I believe you can only get in your teenage years. And at the end of the day, all I wanted from my father back then was some praise and some encouragement and emotional support in which a son usually expects from his father. So when I went up to my dad and said something as in, "Dad, I almost got a full score in TOEFL," his answer was always in the lines of, "So what, you know how hard I raised you? You should be getting those type of scores, and why did you not get a full score?" And these words do upset me to this very day, as fair enough if he did work hard to raise me, but the fact of the matter is that he never raised me. I was raised by my mother and my grandparents from my mother's side. I only saw my dad only like twice a year, as he was always up to doing all kinds of other shenanigans that did not involve visiting my mother and I. Anyways, the point that I want to make here is that I firmly believe that I'm not the only one who had to be raised with such a father, as I'm sure that millions of teenagers in Japan right now are also growing up with a parent of similar or even worse characteristics. So when it comes to teenagers in Japan not being praised throughout youth and not receiving the treatment that helps increase their level of self-confidence, I viscerally agree to this statement and how this could contribute to overt delinquency. Fortunately, in my case, I always enjoyed sports from a young age, and I believe this helped me tremendously when it came to releasing such forms of stress and frustration raised from child-parent relations. Thirdly, Professor Sakta suggests that we have to avoid permanently labeling such teenagers as quote-unquote delinquents, as he states that around 80% of teenage delinquency is transient, with most of them eventually turning into ordinary adults. So in order to avoid them in becoming further desperate and further self-identifying themselves as quote-unquote delinquents, and thus commit further delinquency, we should be careful when it comes to labeling them and instead help them to get out of the transient phase as fast as possible. Professor Sakta does make additional suggestions, such as having the teenagers partake in club activities, sending teenagers who do not suit traditional academic education to vocational schools in order to keep them occupied in a constructive direction and not force them to do something that they don't like, which in their case is studying in the traditional academic sense. And lastly, actively help these teenagers in being able to manage their difficulties in life in constructive ways. And I absolutely agree with this set of measures suggested by Professor Sakta and wish that more parents and individuals who work in the education sector in Japan take a more active approach in implementing these potential treatments for teenage delinquency.